Welcome, welcome. We are going to be talking about individual taxation, which I know is an exciting area, and some of you are familiar with this. You've done your own tax returns and so on. Some of you do a 1040EZ, which unfortunately they're not going to tell. They don't say, please prepare a 5-line 1040EZ and have a lovely day, become a CPA. No, generally so much more detailed. This is the first area of tax. We're going to be going through tax first. So we're going to 60%, so we're going to cover individual, corporate, S-corps, partnerships, estates, trust, gift, exempt organizations, property transactions, depreciation, AMT, and all that. Then we'll move on to professional responsibilities and ethics, because those areas alone are about 20%. Then business law used to be, back in my day, its own exam. So it was its own 3.5-hour exam back when I was your age, many moons ago, pre-gray hair. So they have a lot, 3.5 hours of information, which is it's 20% of a 3-hour exam. So you can see that there's a lot of material for law, even though it's only 20%, because they've kind of pared it down. So you need a little bit about a lot, especially when it comes to business law. Now, in starting out with individual taxation, you do not need to memorize things like the tax code, right? The IRC, or Internal Revenue Code, you will use for research, but you don't need to memorize that. You don't need to memorize necessarily cost of living adjusted information, because again, these numbers change every year. For example, bankruptcy, every 3 years they update the numbers. Those we need to know. But numbers like your standard deduction, personal exemptions, you don't need to know those. Why not? Because they change every year. The AICPA cannot afford to update every single question every single year for those numbers. So those are things you don't need to know. You do need to know the schedules. What is Schedule A? Schedule A, itemized deductions. Schedule B, interest and dividends. Schedule C, profit or loss from a trade or business. Schedule D, capital gains and losses. Schedule E, flow through entities, rental, royalty, S-corps, partnership, K1 income flows through. Schedule F, farm income. Those are things you will need to know. You will need to know certain thresholds. For example, medical expenses is 10%. Used to be 7.5%. It's 10%. Unless you're 65 or older, then it's still 7.5%. But you do need to know things like that, medical deductions. You do need to know, for example, 2% miscellaneous deductions. So that's business, investment, tax preparation, and so on. So those are things you will need to know. As we go through the questions, you'll see very important. Now, one of the things that I want to point out is when you're preparing for the exam, taxes are always changing. The thing is, there's at least a 6-month window between laws changing and it hits the exam. That means that, let's say you're taking an exam in the first part of 2014, that's 2013 law. The second half of 14 would be 2014 law. The first part of 2015 would be 14 law. The second part of 15 would be 15 law. So I want you to realize that the first 2 windows of the year are always the previous year's tax rules, and then the second part would be that current year's, because it gave you 6 months for those things to change. But that's why, again, there's that overlap. That's why they're not going to test you on the specific things as far as standard deductions, things that change, but rules like the 10%, that's not going to necessarily change. Those are the numbers that they're going to like to test you on. So that's important before we even jump in, so you understand what's happening. Now, you'll see here, and I love memory aids and mnemonics. I'm Mr. Mnemonic. Woohoo, right? I love these things because they help you, once you understand it, to then be able to recall it. So that's the purpose of it. What we're going to be looking at here is our basic 1040 tax return. And the 1040, we've got our schedules A, B, C, D, and so on. With your tax return, it starts out with your filing status. Filing status means, what are you as of December 31st? Right? So if you're sitting at home alone watching TV and watching the ball drop with whatever, Ryan Seacrest or Dick Clark, I think he's died now. But anyway, you watch the ball drop, you're single because you're alone, home alone, and crying. All right, that's single. Married filing joint, married filing separate, head of household. We'll have to learn what all the distinctions are between those categories. Exemptions. What's an exemption? Myself, I'm alive, woohoo, I get a certain amount of money. I'm married filing joint, so I have myself, my personal exemption. My spouse would also be a personal exemption. So the two of us, we would get a certain amount of money, let's just say roughly $4,000. And again, it changes every year, $39,000, $39,500, $4,000, and so on. You don't need to memorize it, but in your notes, you will have the current number just in case you wanted it. So that is it. Then I've got these wonderful little rugrats running around, my kids. So the question is that a qualified child or is it a qualified relative, dependent? we'll have to see, because if you count, then I get another 4,000 for you, 4,000 for you, 4,000 for you. So I get 4,000 for me, 4,000 for my wife, 4,000 for my kid, my other kid, the other kid. What about a cousin who lives with me? I don't know. Let's see. Are they a relative? We'll learn that later on. So I get all those exemptions. I got 5 of them at 4,000. That's another 20 grand. Woohoo! Then I've got income. So we'll go through the detail of the income, but one of the things that I want you to see is the flow of the 1040. And the flow is as follows.